Edmund, the Arrivals. Bree's heavy fingers worked their ways through Edmund's knotted hair, stroking harshly across his scalp that she drenched in oils many times over, not showing any signs of quitting until she had finally rid his head of filth. "You didn't bathe, not even once?" Bree asked him as she struggled through his vicious locks. "A ship is no place for it," he told her, enjoying the feeling of the warm water around his naked body as he sat in his iron tub. The guards had struggled moments before to carry it between them up the many stairs that led to Edmund's chambers. "Gale has many bathhouses, as does the Salt Coast. You reek of the sea, my lord." "I ought to keep it that way," Edmund said with a small smirk. "Make the noblemen's daughters run away from my awful stench and go back to wherever it is they set sail from." Bree rolled her eyes. "You know, you are perfectly capable of bathing yourself, my lord." "Yes, I am. But I've been wanting your advice on these following days ahead and what your thoughts on it might be." "You have 4 advisors in this castle, as well as a father and a brother who I'm certain will be happy to advise you. They will give counsel on any matter you have about the upcoming gathering." "They are not you," he said proudly, as Bree was finally satisfied with her fight against his stubborn head of hair. She smiled. "I suppose I'm just worried at the thought of someone walking in, my lord." Edmund chuckled. "I think my father would be pleased to find me naked in my chambers in the company of a young woman." The two of them shared a short laugh. Edmund reached an arm from the tub and seized a chalice from the floor that he drained swiftly, dizzying his head in a hope to make the day ahead of him a little less insufferable. The 3 that had already passed had been a constant stream of tedious talks with the keepers of the islands and his stupid father. And now the day of the gathering was upon them. "And what kind of advice are you looking for from me that my uncle or his fellow keepers cannot offer you?" Bree asked, wiping away her smirk as she oiled her hands once again. Edmund sighed. "I can't marry," he stated in a tone that was only serious, and nothing else. "Or I won't. I will not stoop as low as my father wants me to and willingly take a bride, just for her to find herself in a lie, a sham of a marriage." "I believe most marriages are lies, my lord. Most of the young girls travelling here today are only doing it because their fathers have forced them forward, the poor things. Some would think being prepared for a life as a scroll keeper is no place for a girl my age, but I would choose the archives every time if it meant I could avoid an arranged marriage." "My father threatened Ollie," Edmund told her. "I almost killed him when he did. I was so close to strangling him in the chair he was sitting on. I know he's on the brink of death, but he still holds the command over the guards, and I can't stop thinking what he might do to him if this gathering does not unfold in the way he had hoped. I just want him dead, to be out of the way before anything starts to happen." A jug of water was poured over his head before he could catch his breath. He gasped as he wiped away his wet fringe and shook his head like a dog fresh from the sea. "All done, at least for now. I'd need more hours than we have if I were to truly have you clean enough for tonight." Bree walked over to the canopy of the bed and fetched his robe, looking to the ceiling as Edmund pulled his naked body to a stand, stepping out onto the cobble flooring of his chambers with bare feet that felt the stab of the cold. In time, their talk had continued until Edmund sat with his reflection ahead of him, watching closely at the razor that Bree was slowly moving across his chin and cheeks, slicing away the unkempt stubble of his beard with a cautious hand. "Your family needs allies, I suppose," Bree said, hardly moving her lips as she kept her eyes strictly on the blade she held. "If you will not allow a marriage, you should at least try forming a friendship or 2. The Crass family were always keen to defend the Saltspear name before the war happened. Perhaps there's an alliance you may wish to rekindle." "The whole world could be against us for all I care," Edmund grunted. "The islands are all under the same rule. We have hundreds of ships between us. There's not a chance any force could take our land. No army has laid siege to the Trident Islands since Brynhall fell." Edmund's search for advice was cast aside by his own lectures that he hated spewing. He reminded himself of his father in those moments. He would always revert to silence in a hope to rid the thought from his mind. Finally, Bree looked proud of his smooth jaw she had been working at before she began her final task of shearing his long brown locks that were stern to cut. Her grasp was firm, yet gentle. She cut at a comfortable pace as she awaited her lord's words to spill into the air again. "Ollie should be on the beaches by now," he uttered. "I asked him to meet me last night at this time." Bree caught wind of his desire to go and see his beloved on the sands. She was already chipping away at the final strands of hair before he spotted the newly sheared man in the mirror, one he had not recognized for a short moment. The curls on his head were tamed. He could see his face again that held no expression as he stood. "Thank you, Bree," he said, nodding to her as she bowed, packing up her small blade and the rest of her things under her arm. Edmund was soon lacing his boots and shirt before pulling back the long green drape at the other side of his chamber that hid away the burrow. The long tunnel that spiraled downwards was his only escape from the castle of guards that were under his father's instructions, ones to keep him from leaving his home. He began his swift descent, avoiding the sharp edges the entire way with a familiar tactic he had used for many years. The burrow had been dug out from the great hill that the flint fort sat on. It had been there since before any soul alive had come into the world. Its history was a cloudy one, without much insight. Raffus had a theory or two. He often believed it was a way for past kings to escape if the island had ever come under siege. Another was that the burrow may have been a discreet way of sneaking in girls during the night, letting them climb to the chambers from the beaches to offer their company, presenting themselves to whichever king or lord lay in the chambers. Edmund used it in a similar way, though the only soul he called up from the beaches was his dear Ollie, sneaking him into his bed during the late storms. None of the dock folk had known about it. The stretch of sand at its entrance was laced in spiked rocks, ones nobody ever dared to traverse. Only Ollie had crossed through it, often appearing with bloody knees or gashed fingers from his treacherous travels, all to reach the company of Edmund. Through the path of spiking rocks that stretched from the grey stone, Edmund soon caught sight of the light that was shining in from the cavern he entered upon letting his feet fall to the sand. The cave was small and led out to the open air and beach on the western side of the island, presenting him with a grey shore filled with large spiked rocks spread across it. On one of the boulders sat his lover, crossing their legs as they tossed stones into the incoming tide. His head had turned slowly as Edmund revealed himself to the sunlight, feeling hardly any warmth from it as the ocean winds kept him brittle with a cruel cold. His reddened face was an easy thing to read. Edmund knew that Ollie had known of what was planned for the day ahead. He had only hoped he could understand that he wanted no part in the things his father was expecting of him. "I suppose it was always coming," Ollie sulked, hopping down from the rock, looking solemn. "You are lord and the heir to the Braille's throne. Of course you would have to marry eventually." "I won't marry anyone," Edmund reassured him, caressing his cheek and kissing him with a passion he most certainly deserved. "My father will surely die before he can force anything." Ollie didn't look at all swayed. "But you're still going to dance with them, court them and speak with them." "It won't mean anything. You know me better than that, Ollie." The boy opposite him waved his words away. He looked out at the sea with his arms crossed once again. Edmund bowed his head, sensing the doubt and worry of the one he loved, silently calling him over for some comfort. Edmund strode over to him and slipped his arms around Ollie's waist, pecking at his neck with soft kisses that he knew made him tickle. "I think you should leave Braille." Ollie's body tensed again, shrugging out of Edmund's grasp and turning to him, looking confused, even mortified in some ways. "What?" "It's about something my father said. He knows about the two of us and he wants it to stop. And if we don't, I think he might do something to you. I don't know what, but we both know what will happen if either of us is found out." "And since when have you ever been scared of your father?" Ollie shot back. "I am not scared of my father," Edmund said with tight lips. "But he has the position. He can still make you disappear, and I don't want us to be taking risks during the gathering. And the gods know I won't be able to resist coming to you unless you're off this island." Ollie stared at him for what felt like an hour of torment. "So you want to just send me away like cattle, so you can be with your new bride and get married all while I'm stuck miles across the sea?" "I just told you there will be no marriage," Edmund yelled, not meaning to sound as callous as he did. "You have seen what happens to the men who do the things we have done. You and I have watched them hang from the castle walls and leave them to rot through the spring. My father knows, Ollie. He has known for a long time, and he has never spoken of it until the gathering was planned and he threatened you. I can't risk anything for your sake, and you should trust me when I swear to you that I have no interest in the girls crossing that sea." Edmund took the small pouch he had buckled to his belt and placed it in Ollie's hands. Inside was a handful of shining silver coins that could buy a wagon full of meals. "There's enough there to bribe a sailor. Get to one of the other islands before nightfall. Yark would be best. Send letters to Bree. She'll make sure they find me so I can find you when my father is gone, and me and you can be together again. Safely together." Ollie pursed his lips in disappointment. "I really wanted to see you in your finest silks tonight, and I had something special for myself that I was planning to wear. I know it feels wrong, but trust me, this is the right thing for us. If you need more money, then you write and ask for some. If you need anything at all, you must promise to write to me." His lover's face fell, not in anguish, but in simple sadness that was adorably heartbreaking to witness. "I will. You know I will." "Good," Edmund said, slowly creeping back toward him before pulling his hips swiftly to clash against his own. "I can hardly survive without hearing your voice, so I'll need those letters to get me through whatever storm lies ahead." Ollie gave a small and hopeful hint of a smile. "Yark?" "Yes, Yark," Edmund smirked. "It's the closest, and it has an entire path of forges. I thought you might find work there, at least until I have you brought back to me." Their talk was on the brink of tears before a distant horn had sounded from the vicious sea. It was a familiar one that Edmund knew well, one so guttural and raw. The two of them turned to see a single ship arriving much earlier than any guests were expected to dock. The sails were dark green and branded with the same sigil as Edmund's own. It was a golden eel that was wrapped around a black spear. It was the sigil of the Saltspear family. "Fuck," Edmund spoke, realizing that this gathering was soon to become a torturous reunion with the one remaining person who shared his family name, his cousin, Sias. "How soon should I leave?" Ollie asked, tucking the pouch into his pocket. "As soon as you can. They'll be clearing the docks for the arrivals within the hour. Pack what you need. You should be docking by dusk." He nodded his head and clutched Edmund by his neck. "I love you." Knowing the green-sailed ship was too far in the distance to make out their identities, Edmund embraced Ollie with his lips, leaving him with a powerful memory to think about when he spent his nights between the shores of one of their neighboring islands. "I love you, and I will see you very soon. I promise." The two of them parted. Edmund hurried for the western docks to greet the voyage that was fast approaching, while Ollie ran to his stall to the east, one full of trinkets to pack with what remained of his things before leaving. Edmund's footing was swift and cautious. He moved through the spiking mounds of rocks that ran across the northern shore. He could soon hear the clanging of bells that lined the docks to announce their new arrival. He moved along the dunes of tall grass, eyeing the vessel that came closer and closer to his home, holding a crowd of chanting drunkards and a single man that stood proudly on the ship's tusk with a grin. His cousin, a man in love with the idea of living and acting like a true lord. Sias was from Morlin. He was given a small title and treated like a nobleman for looking over his very own island and overseeing its people and resources. His home stank with the stench of brothels and wine, all of which he had planned for when he built houses full of whores shipped in from the mainland with a promise of mountains of coin. He wasn't wrong in his promises. The brothels of Morlin had become a spectacle on the map over the few years that had passed. Merchants, pirates, traders, and even men from noble names had made the journey to visit the famous rock in the sea to gawk at their infamous methods. In time, Morlin soon had a second name that Edmund spat at once he had first heard of it: Whore Island, a place he wasn't proud to soon rule over. The last time he had seen his cousin was when Byron turned 14 a little over a year ago. He seemed to be the only person on the islands who was a tough challenge during drinking challenges. Sias's drunken self was the only time the two of them could get along, but under the circumstances of the day he had arrived on, Edmund was not open to any fake friendliness toward his stupid cousin. "There he is!" Sias called across the docks with that familiar, irritating voice. He had launched from the edge of his ship and landed on the slanting wood between the stalls, shoving his way through the crowd of working men and women with a face full of stubble. "The soon-to-be lord of the Trident Islands, ready for an armada of girls to anchor at his shores." Foul-mouthed, a captain of a ship, and an utter drunk. The similarities between the two of them were twisted kind of uncanny, yet Edmund could only loathe everything about him and his idea of sick humor. "I wasn't expecting to see you here," Edmund called out as he approached him across the docks. "Did the promise of rum and feasts persuade you to cross the sea?" Edmund asked, knotting his hands behind his back to avoid his cousin's grip. "And the woman!" "Don't forget the woman," he sniggered. Edmund was then seized in the tight grasp of his cousin. He clenched his head and messed up his newly sheared hair to force a scowl from him. After nudging him away, the pair turned to stare at the ship that Cyrus had arrived in. It was rather striking, but Edmund wasn't all impressed. He instead just read the writing engraved into the wooden stern. The Sea Spire. It was certainly worthy of the name it had, floating sharp on the sea with a head like a spear. "She is a beauty, isn't she, cousin?" Cyrus said proudly, looking at his voyage like it was a precious wife of his that he adored more than anything. "Mine's bigger," Edmund told him, holding back a smile. Cyrus let out a childish laugh, clutching his cousin once more in his heavy arms and leading him away from the docks into the sand. He reeked with a stench of rum and seawater, along with a mix of sweat and ripe scents from a woman, most definitely one of the ladies that Edmund spotted scurrying around the deck of Cyrus's ship. "Come on, let us have a stroll along the beach for a talk before I see my beloved uncle, eh?" The thought of staying far from his father was enough to convince him to accept the proposal. His cousin was always an aggravating soul to be in the company of, but a lecture from his father would always be the most crippling of conversations. They had already strolled far enough for the docks to fade out of sight, leaving them surrounded by nothing but sea, sand, and the haunting shadow of the castle above. "How does it feel knowing you've got a few dozen girls on their way to this rock in the sea just for a chance at your hand?" Cyrus questioned him, falling back to rest on the sand with that same stupid grin. Edmund couldn't really unfold how he felt. He hadn't given much thought to this night at all, ever since it was announced. But now all he could think about was how torturous it would feel to court a flock of women he knew he could never possibly wed. "Unnecessary. I don't see the need in all the festivities. It seems as though a woman from Braille or just one of the islands would do." "I wouldn't object, dear cousin. I don't think you realize how fucking lucky you are. Women from the mainland are complete deviants. They like it rough in the sheets and are exactly your type to pursue." Cyrus seemed to relish in the thought of the women of the West. It made him chuckle and grow even more excited for the gathering of the night ahead. "Is it true there's one coming all the way from Saskara? I've never been with a Saskaran girl before. Oh, I'd bet they're one of a kind. If you don't favor her tonight, then I'll be sure to sweep her up and show her how us islanders do it here in the south." "I haven't asked my father anything about any of it. Festive gatherings aren't of interest to me, as well as the guests that come with them." Cyrus scoffed quietly. "And how is my dear Uncle Brian? I assume you're happy the prick finally has his days numbered." Edmund couldn't control the subtle smile that sprung from him at the insult toward his father. Those insults were one of the very few things he and Cyrus mutually enjoyed bonding over. "Sickly, coughing up blood at each hour that passes." They both shared a moment of joy, knowing that soon they would be rid of him and his terrible attempt of ruling over the Trident Islands. "Let's hope tonight he chokes then. The earlier his demise, the better. You'll of course open up those castle gates," Cyrus hinted, grinning just at the thought of it. "Parties every night, the halls filled with barrels of rum and 100 girls for the two of us to choose from. That is what I'm eager to see when that crown falls to you, cousin." To be alone with Ollie, to spend each passing day as the Lord with his lover at his side and no one to object to them. That is what he wanted his reign to be. All that he needed to reach that life of freedom and paradise was to only pray, continuously pray for his father's long-awaited death that he so desperately wanted to make haste. He thought that perhaps his cousin did have a point. The gates hadn't been opened in almost a decade since his mother's passing, and the week had been nothing but boredom and silence ever since Edmund was pulled back from the sea. The only reason he had gone out to sea so many times was to be as far from his wretched father as he possibly could. Edmund nodded, smirking almost. "They'll never close again." The two of them continued their talks on the sands, speaking of their mischief as youngsters, as well as speaking insults regarding the many families that would soon be arriving. House Crass and House Drine were being slaughtered by their slanders. They spoke of their desires to throw them from their shores, recalling their histories of weak-willed lords. Sias was persistent in his tarnishing when it came to the Meade family. Their incestual lives had forced both laughter and resentment from his lips. It would come as no surprise to Edmund if his cousin was responsible for Rosalind Meade's tears. He would undoubtedly slate her and the house she was a part of, mocking her twisted roots. In time, Sias's wicked tongue soon retired, speaking only of how he wished to prepare himself for the gathering ahead. Their path soon turned back to the dreaded flint fort that was now being adorned in the green banners of their house. It was a sad attempt at making his home look less dull than what it actually was. The cousins parted at the gate. Sias was on the hunt for Byron, ready to wrestle and tease him after their long time apart. Edmund headed for his chambers, knowing his appearance would be criticized if Bree had not had the chance to work her magic, stripping it of its unkemptness. He slumped and sulked his way up the many stairs, silently speaking with the gods, debating the strength he proposed he needed for the torturous path ahead of him. After all the prayers he had thrown their way regarding his father's demise, he soon assumed that the gods were either deaf in the ears or proud to be ignorant cunts. He reached the peak of the stairs, huffing with dread as he entered. Soon Edmund's body was tampered with by Bree's intricate hand. She stitched and lengthened his garments with a precise eye. She was his savior in any time he desired to look presentable. She knew of every method to have him looking grand enough for even a gathering. But his desire was absent from their company. He couldn't care less about the way he looked, though he knew that decent enough attire would save him from at least one of his father's disparaging remarks. He admired her work, and of course the man in the mirror that looked back at him. The tunic he wore was a deep green, embroidered with ivy and golden thread that laced smoothly throughout the silk. He only wished Ollie could see him at that moment. The entire gathering seemed like an unnecessary and dull affair, but he couldn't help but commend all of the pageantry that Bree had achieved. He only wished her efforts were to please Ollie instead of the eager strangers that were visiting. The dark, scratchy pants were pulled over his brays, and the thick boots were enough to lift his spirits, just as his styled curls that were tight on his head did, compared to the scruffy look he always had from weeks at sea. The sky outside was a cloak of darkening grey. The night ahead was sure to have yet another common storm to be drowned out by the impending gathering attended by a few hundred guests. "You look as gallant as ever, my lord," Bree said, looking over her work and bathing in the pride she had for it. "If that's all, I was summoned by your father to assist in the preparations down in the Great Hall." He nodded to her, and she immediately headed for the door, ready to turn the dreary Great Hall of the Flint Fort into something worthy of a Felian queen that was surely fast approaching. Edmund's father's strange idea to invite the entire island through his doors was a surprise, even if the population was shallow. It was certain to make the gathering intensely more cramped, along with all of their rich visitors. The thought of the arriving noble men and women cast a sigh from him. He neared over to the balcony at the edge of his room and peered over the vast sea of approaching ships. His gaze fell to the docks, the ones that stretched far up and down the sand with an already exceeded capacity of voyagers with many different colours across their sails. The late arrivals had anchored in the distance, sending out a dozen canoes that joined together like an army rowing toward him across the tide, each carrying a young girl who would soon be presented to him along with her proposal. Noblemen, along with their families, and of course their daughters, had met with the guards, following their escort along the colossal path that stretched in curls all the way up the hill the castle stood on. He could barely see any of his potential brides from the height he was at, but the dazzling colours of dresses that draped across the shores stuck out easily among the grey dunes and cobble paths. "They're all here for you," he reminded himself, not feeling any sort of flattery or joy in the idea. He began itching at his skin just at the thought of it all, how he knew he wouldn't want a marriage or a bride. He just wanted Ollie, but it seemed that everything was against his wish, and the terrible gathering was happening, without question. A horn cursed the ashen beach. The sound of it was foreign to Edmund, one that he had never heard before out at sea. His face turned in an instant, looking out to the source over the fog of sails, widening his eyes at the giant of a ship that approached the reserved space on the docks. It was wide enough to fit 3 of the noblemen's voyagers, perhaps even a 4th. It was a bigger ship than Edmund's by a great amount. It boiled jealousy within him as he gawked at the exquisite art of the vessel. Its wood was like a tapestry, shrouded with 1,000 carvings of flowers and branches. At the very front of the ship stood 2 statues of claws, like those of a scorpion stretched out over the sea that the voyage sailed across with such grace. The rear of the ship wielded another piece of carved wooden art, one that resembled 3 piercing scorpion tails that were crafted to divine perfection. The wide sails of magenta shadowed over the 30 men that used all their strength to reel it in with a dozen ropes. Among the flailing sails was a black silhouette of 1,000,000 stitches. It was, of course, a scorpion with 3 tails that stretched to the edges of the surrounding oval. Edmund had a small understanding of the noble families that lived in the north. He could certainly never recite them all, but the one ahead of him had never crossed his eye when he had flicked through the histories of the world. He hadn't believed the idea of having Saskaran visitors at first, but now a monumental voyage was docked on the shores of his home. A flock of others had come with it, also anchoring in the distance and spewing more canoes across the way with the banners of House Corps being held high by the loyal soldiers that served under the Northern Queen. A bridge stretched to the dock from the mighty ship, allowing a parade of arrivals to flurry toward the guards that kept the mongrels at bay. What followed was a sight that made Edmund near as close as he could over his stone railing. A throne, one held up by 8 men holding the 2 logs under it as it was carried slowly over the bridge toward the docks. The lady that sat on it was draped in the familiar color of the sails, along with all the types of shades of purple and pink. Behind her came another raised throne, this time holding yet another royal woman, only younger and wearing half as many layers as the one she had followed. The Queen of Philia and her daughter, the princess, both of whom he couldn't remember the names of. Despite their glory, Edmund couldn't help but stare at the ones that held the royals on their shoulders. They were men, shirtless and shackled, and not wearing any shoes for the long journey up the hill. The thing that caught his eye most was their skin, scattered with ink and markings that he couldn't make out from his distance from them, but he knew what it meant. Slaves. He had seen a few. They weren't as common in the south, but some of his more sinister neighbors of the Trident Islands were not strangers to sending coins up to Saskara to trade for a few beaten slaves. Specifically Garland and his sadistic cousin, who often worked theirs to death. Edmund would never allow it in Braille, just as his father wouldn't. It was one of the very few things he had respect for him for. Edmund spat at the cruelty of the North. The thought of marrying a girl who treated innocent people like dogs was impossible to him. He was certain to get a closer look at the royals, the dresses, and the poor slaves during the upcoming gathering. After watching over his new arrivals march in a line toward his castle, he returned to the stained mirror and gave one last look over himself, rather impressed at his scrubbed skin and clean-cut jaw. The time for his dozen proposals from women he knew he wouldn't want had come. His love and his loyalty was reserved entirely for the man who he had sent overseas. He knew he would miss him dearly, but was glad that he was somewhere safer than within the same shores as his father. The Flint Fort was under siege, not from enemies or souls that thirsted for his blood, but by naive young ladies that flocked through his gates, flaunting their colors and their pretty heads of hair. Edmund stood ready to defend his hand from their threats and fantasies of marriage.